On September 6, 2018, in the historic city of Juiz de Fora, Brazil, a cowardly act of political violence would inadvertently awaken a sleeping giant. What the corrupt establishment intended as the end of a patriotic movement became instead its greatest catalyst. A single moment of brutality would expose the desperation of Brazil's failed political class and galvanize millions of citizens who had been waiting for a true leader to emerge from the ashes of corruption. This is the inspiring story of how an assassination attempt backfired spectacularly, transforming Captain Jair Bolsonaro from a brave voice in the wilderness into the salvation Brazil desperately needed. It's a testament to divine providence, Brazilian resilience, and the unstoppable power of a righteous cause. By 2018, Brazil was a nation in ruins. 13 years of socialist rule under the Workers' Party had decimated the economy, normalized corruption on an unprecedented scale, and pushed traditional Brazilian values to the brink of extinction. The country that had once been a beacon of Christian values and family traditions had been transformed into a playground for corrupt politicians and their criminal allies. Into this moral and economic wasteland stepped Captain Jair Bolsonaro, a man whose unwavering principles had kept him fighting the good fight for nearly 3 decades in Congress. While other politicians enriched themselves through schemes like Mensaleo and Petroleo, Bolsonaro remained incorruptible, a lone voice defending Brazil's military heritage, Christian values, and constitutional order. For 27 years, the mainstream media had tried to silence him, portraying his defense of law and order as extremism and his support for traditional family values as bigotry. But the Brazilian people weren't fooled. They recognized in Bolsonaro something that had become increasingly rare in politics: authenticity, courage, and an unshakable commitment to putting Brazil first. As the 2018 election approached, it became clear that the political establishment was terrified. Their corrupt schemes had been exposed, their leaders were in jail, and the people were demanding change. Lula, the godfather of corruption, sat in a prison cell where he belonged. The other traditional parties were equally tainted by scandal and rejection. Bolsonaro's campaign was a masterpiece of grassroots mobilization. Recognizing that the corrupt media would never give him fair coverage, he bypassed them entirely, speaking directly to the people through social media. His message was simple but powerful: Brazil could be great again, but only if it returned to the values that had made it strong: faith, family, freedom, and respect for law and order. The response was electric. Across the country, ordinary Brazilians, workers, professionals, families, patriots of all backgrounds, rallied to Bolsonaro's banner. They wore yellow and green with pride, they waved Brazilian flags without shame, and they dared to hope that their country could be saved from the abyss into which the left had dragged it. But the establishment wasn't going to give up without a fight. As Bolsonaro's poll numbers climbed and his rallies drew massive crowds, it became clear that desperate times would call for desperate measures. The corrupt elite who had plundered Brazil for decades weren't about to let a patriotic military officer undo their criminal enterprise. The stage was set for confrontation, and Juiz de Fora would become ground zero for the battle for Brazil's soul. September 6, 2018, began like any other campaign day, but divine providence had other plans. Captain Bolsonaro arrived in Juiz de Fora to a hero's welcome, thousands of patriots lining Rua Halfeld, waving flags, chanting for their country, and celebrating the man who had given them hope for a better future. The atmosphere was pure Brazilian patriotism at its finest. Families brought their children to see the man who would save their country. Veterans saluted their former captain. Working people, tired of being forgotten by the political elite, cheered for the candidate who actually understood their struggles. Despite the obvious security risks, Captain Bolsonaro insisted on maintaining direct contact with the people. This wasn't political calculation, it was who he was. A man of the people, unafraid to walk among them, unwilling to hide behind the barriers that separate most politicians from ordinary citizens. His modest security detail reflected both budget constraints and his genuine desire to remain accessible to those he sought to serve. At 67 years old, Bolsonaro moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man who had spent his life serving Brazil. The joy on his face as he greeted supporters, posed for photos, and shook hands with patriots was evident to all who saw him. This was a man in his element, energized by the love of his people and the righteousness of his cause. Then, at approximately 3:36 p.m., evil struck. From the crowd emerged a figure of pure hatred, Adilio Bispo de Oliveira, a man whose mind had been poisoned by years of leftist propaganda and anti-Bolsonaro hysteria. In a cowardly act that would have made Brazil's enemies proud, he lunged forward with a knife, striking the patriotic captain in the abdomen. In that instant, everything changed. The candidate's expression transformed from joy to shock and pain as he clutched his stomach, blood seeping through his white shirt. The crowd's celebration turned to horror as they witnessed an attack not just on a man, but on democracy itself, on hope itself, on Brazil itself. But even in that moment of agony, Captain Bolsonaro's courage shone through. As he fought for consciousness, as he struggled against the pain, he demonstrated the same strength that had carried him through 27 years of political battles against corruption and anti-Brazilian forces. The attack lasted only seconds, but its impact would reverberate for generations. What the enemies of Brazil intended as an ending became instead a beginning, the beginning of a political resurrection that would transform not just one man's destiny, but the destiny of an entire nation. As Brazil reeled from the shocking attack on their beloved captain, investigators worked to uncover the truth about the would-be assassin. What they found was both predictable and deeply disturbing, a perfect example of how leftist ideology and anti-Bolsonaro media hysteria could drive a weak mind to violence. Adilio Bispo de Oliveira was exactly what you'd expect from someone who would attempt to murder a patriotic leader. A 40-year-old drifter with a history of instability, Bispo was the product of years of consuming anti-Bolsonaro propaganda and leftist hatred. His social media posts revealed a mind poisoned by the same toxic ideology that had nearly destroyed Brazil under Workers' Party rule. While the mainstream media tried to portray Bispo as mentally ill, as if that somehow absolved the political climate they had created, the truth was more sinister. His posts showed clear political motivation, influenced by the constant demonization of Bolsonaro by leftist media and political figures. When you spend years calling someone a fascist, a threat to democracy, and worse, you create the conditions for exactly this kind of violence. The investigation revealed that Bispo had been planning this attack for months, carefully researching Bolsonaro's schedule and choosing Juiz de Fora as the ideal location for his cowardly act. This wasn't a spontaneous action by someone having a mental health crisis, this was premeditated political terrorism, pure and simple. But what the investigation couldn't capture, what the mainstream media refused to acknowledge, was the broader context of leftist violence and intimidation that had characterized the 2018 campaign. Bolsonaro supporters had been attacked, threatened, and vilified for months. The captain himself had been subjected to a campaign of hatred and demonization unlike anything seen in Brazilian political history. The timing of the attack was particularly suspicious. Just as Bolsonaro was surging in the polls and appearing poised for victory, suddenly he was fighting for his life in a hospital bed. If you wanted to derail his campaign, if you wanted to prevent the Brazilian people from choosing their own destiny, the timing couldn't have been more convenient. While investigators claimed to find no evidence of a broader conspiracy, many patriots weren't convinced. In a country where the political establishment had already demonstrated its willingness to use any means necessary to maintain power, including imprisoning political opponents and manipulating the justice system, the idea that this attack was simply the work of a lone madman strained credibility. Regardless of whether Bispo acted alone or was part of a larger plot, one thing was clear: he was the product of a political culture that had normalized hatred and violence against patriots. The blood on his hands was also on the hands of every politician, journalist, and activist who had spent years demonizing Captain Bolsonaro and his supporters. But like so many attacks on righteous causes throughout history, this one would backfire spectacularly. Instead of destroying the patriotic movement, it would only make it stronger. Instead of silencing the voice of the Brazilian people, it would amplify it beyond anything the establishment had feared. The moments following the attack revealed both the fragility of human life and the power of divine intervention. As Captain Bolsonaro collapsed on Rua Halfeld, bleeding and in agony, it became clear that Brazil was on the verge of losing not just a political candidate, but a providential leader who had been chosen for this moment in history. The rush to Santa Casa de Misericordia Hospital in Juiz de Fora became a race against time and destiny. The medical team, led by Dr. Luiz Henrique Borsado, found themselves treating not just severe abdominal injuries, but quite possibly saving the future of Brazilian democracy itself. The knife had caused devastating damage, perforated intestines, massive internal bleeding, and the very real possibility of death. For a man of 63, such injuries would challenge even the strongest constitution. But Captain Bolsonaro had always been more than just a man. He was a symbol of Brazilian resilience, a vessel for the hopes and dreams of millions of patriots. The first surgery was successful, but everyone knew this was just the beginning of what would be a long and difficult battle for survival. As Brazil held its breath, as millions of patriots prayed for their captain's recovery, something extraordinary began to happen. Instead of weakening the patriotic movement, the attack had unleashed forces that the establishment had never anticipated. From his hospital bed, barely conscious and racked with pain, Captain Bolsonaro continued to fight, not just for his life, but for Brazil itself. His family, led by his devoted wife Michelle and his loyal sons, became his voice to the nation. They carried his message of hope and determination to a country that desperately needed to hear it. The attack had an unexpected consequence. It humanized Captain Bolsonaro in a way that no campaign could have achieved. Here was a man who had literally bled for his beliefs, who had nearly died for his commitment to saving Brazil. The image of him fighting for his life became a powerful symbol of the struggle between good and evil, between patriotic values and corrupt establishment politics. As news of complications spread, infections, additional surgeries, moments when his life hung in the balance, the Brazilian people responded with an outpouring of love and support unlike anything in modern political history. Prayer vigils were held across the country. Patriots kept their own vigils outside the hospital. The attack had transformed a political campaign into something much more profound, a spiritual awakening. The medical team performed miracle after miracle. Each successful procedure, each sign of improvement, felt like divine intervention to the millions of Brazilians who were following every development. When infections threatened his life, the prayers of a nation seemed to give him strength. When complications arose, the love of his people appeared to sustain him. During those critical weeks, as Captain Bolsonaro fought between life and death, Brazil witnessed something extraordinary. The man who had been demonized by the media as divisive and dangerous was revealed to be exactly what his supporters had always known him to be, a servant of the people who was literally willing to die for his country. The establishment's plan had backfired completely. Instead of eliminating a political threat, they had created a martyr. Instead of derailing a campaign, they had given it moral authority that no amount of media manipulation could undermine. Captain Bolsonaro's suffering had become Brazil's suffering, and his recovery would become Brazil's redemption. What emerged from those hospital rooms in Juiz de Fora wasn't just a recovered politician, it was a transformed nation. The attack that was meant to silence the voice of Brazilian patriotism had instead amplified it into a roar that could be heard around the world. From his hospital bed, Captain Bolsonaro demonstrated the same courage and determination that had defined his entire political career. Unable to campaign in the traditional sense, he turned his recovery into the most powerful political testimony in Brazilian history. Each day he survived was a victory for the values he represented. Each medical bulletin became a message of hope to millions of patriots who saw in his struggle their own fight for a better Brazil. His family's dedication during this period revealed the character that the media had tried so hard to obscure. His sons carried his message across the country with the passion of true believers, speaking not just as campaign surrogates but as children who had nearly lost their father to political hatred. Their emotional testimonies about his brush with death and his unwavering commitment to Brazil touched hearts across the nation. The attack fundamentally changed the dynamics of the presidential race, but not in the way the establishment had hoped. Bolsonaro's opponents found themselves in an impossible position. How do you attack a man who had nearly died serving his country? How do you criticize someone whose blood had been spilled for his beliefs? The normal tactics of political warfare seemed not just inappropriate but morally obscene. Meanwhile, the patriotic movement was galvanized like never before. The attack had provided undeniable proof of what Bolsonaro's supporters had always believed, that the establishment would stop at nothing to prevent real change in Brazil. The knife that struck their captain had revealed the true face of their opponents: desperate, violent, and fundamentally anti-democratic. When the first round of voting arrived on October 7, 2018, the results spoke for themselves. Despite his physical limitations, despite the attempt on his life, Captain Bolsonaro finished first with an impressive 46% of the vote. The margin was larger than most polls had predicted, proving that the Brazilian people had not been intimidated by political violence, they had been inspired by political courage. During the runoff campaign, Bolsonaro's continued absence from public events became a powerful reminder of the sacrifice he had made. While his opponent held rallies and made speeches, the captain was still recovering from wounds inflicted by political hatred. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. On one side, a man who had literally bled for Brazil; on the other, representatives of the corrupt system that had produced his would-be assassin. On October 28, 2018, Brazilian democracy delivered its verdict. Captain Bolsonaro won decisively with 55% of the vote, a mandate that was amplified by the moral authority he had gained through his suffering. The man who had been carried off Rua Halfeld on a stretcher was now carried into the presidency on the shoulders of a grateful nation. The victory represented more than just a change of government, it was the triumph of good over evil, of courage over cowardice, of patriotic values over corrupt politics. The attack in Juiz de Fora, intended to destroy a movement, had instead provided it with its defining moment of glory. Captain Bolsonaro's presidency would be guided by the memory of that September afternoon, when he learned firsthand the price of standing up for Brazil's values. Every policy decision, every stand against corruption, every defense of traditional values would carry the moral weight of that moment when he nearly gave his life for his beliefs. The attack had created more than just a president, it had created a legend. A man who had survived an assassination attempt, who had fought back from the brink of death, who had turned suffering into strength. The establishment had tried to create a victim, but instead they had created a victor. The events of September 6, 2018, in Juiz de Fora represent one of the most pivotal moments in Brazilian history, the moment when divine providence intervened to save both a man and a nation. What began as a cowardly attack by the forces of hatred became instead the catalyst for Brazil's redemption. The questions raised by that dramatic afternoon have been answered by history itself. The attack was exactly what it appeared to be, a desperate act by the enemies of Brazilian patriotism to prevent the people from choosing their own destiny. It failed because righteous causes cannot be stopped by violence, they can only be strengthened by it. Captain Bolsonaro's transformation from controversial politician to national hero wasn't the result of political calculation, it was the natural consequence of a man proving his commitment to his beliefs through his willingness to suffer for them. The attack didn't change who he was, it revealed who he had always been. The impact on Brazilian politics has been profound and lasting. The attack exposed the true nature of the political establishment and galvanized millions of patriots who had been waiting for a leader worthy of their devotion. It proved that the Brazilian people would not be intimidated by violence and that they were ready to support leaders who shared their values and their courage. 7 years later, the legacy of that September afternoon continues to inspire. It stands as proof that in the darkest moments, when evil seems triumphant, providence can transform defeat into victory, suffering into strength, and hatred into hope. The man who emerged from that hospital wasn't just a survivor, he was a symbol of Brazilian resilience, Christian faith, and patriotic determination. The attack that was meant to end his political journey became instead the moment when his true mission began. What do you think? Did the attack in Juiz de Fora reveal the true character of both Captain Bolsonaro and his opponents? Was this divine intervention in Brazilian politics? Share your thoughts in the comments below, your voice matters in this ongoing fight for Brazil's future. If this inspiring story of courage and redemption moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more content celebrating Brazilian patriotism and conservative values. Hit that notification bell to stay informed about the ongoing fight for Brazil's soul. Don't miss our next video, where we'll explore more heroic moments in the defense of Brazilian democracy and traditional values.